Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on your locations in the world. Welcome you to the Asian American Scholar Forum webinar in October. Every month we have one. My name is Xiaodong Zhang. I'm also a member of the forum. I'm a professor of computer science and engineering at The Ohio State University. The webinar topic today is about ourselves, our culture, and the perspectives about us from the society. The webinar is sponsored by several Asian American organizations. Each of them will give a short introduction. Please start your introduction. Who will be the first?
Should I go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zhang. This is S.K. Low. I'm a president of AAUC, or Asian American Unity Coalition. Our organization is very happy to be the sponsor for the Asian American Scholar Forum. Our core values are diversity, unity, and equality, because we believe that diversity is our asset, unity is our power, and equality is our goal. And we would like you to learn more about AAUC through our website. And our website is called asamunitycoalition.org. We also have a monthly audio podcast. Is sponsored by 7 different platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify, and other platforms. Just go to podcast/AAUC. I'm done.
Thank you. And who will be the next?
I think that'll be Anthony.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Anthony Yang, Executive Director of Civic Leadership USA, proud sponsor of the Asian American Scholar Forum. CLUSA is dedicated to civic leadership development with a moral compass and unity coalition building among API communities and beyond. That's why quite a few of old friends that I see here that we worked with the last couple of years. All our grants program are nonpartisan and inclusive of all Americans, regardless of ethnic group or country of origin. With a venture philanthropic approach since 2015, CLUSA has conducted more than 79 civic leadership forums and supported over 500 youth interns in 35 cities and 15 states. We also sponsor an annual National Civic Leadership Forum in Washington, D.C. in the last few years, and it turned virtual since 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic, with over 750 registered participants and over 150 speakers from around the country. So check us out, clusa.org.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go next. Hello, this is Hua Wang, and I'm the co-chair of New England Chinese American Alliance. So we just fondly been called NECA. So NECA's journey, started really last year during the global fight for the pandemic. And so there were over 50 organizations in the New England area joined forces to battling the COVID-19. And we undertake a epic, COVID-19 relief campaign, with over $500,000 and over 600,000 pieces of PPE and so on and so forth. So during this process, all these organizations, we said, we're going to turn our attention to something more fundamental and more for the future. So that's the birth of NECA. So our vision is to lead and inspire Chinese American community for civic participation, political engagement. We want to elevate the status of Chinese American communities in politics, and we strive to be the go-to group to serve the community for societal political matters. And we also want to inspire young generations to devote themselves to social services and generate a profound impact on society affairs. We're very proud to be a co-sponsor for this, Asian American Scholar Forum, and for a very timely, important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I can speak next. My name is Vincent Wang. I'm the chair of the Ohio Chinese American Association. It's an honor to be the co-host for this important event tonight, organized by the Asian American Scholars Forum. Thank you so much for the organizers, Joy, Guo, and Dr. Zhang, and so many of you guys who worked so hard behind the scene to make this happen. And Ohio's Chinese American Association was founded in 2016 by riding the wave of social justice movement among the Asian American community, especially 2016, we supported New York former policeman Peter Liang, and later on we supported Chinese American scientists such as Dr. Xiaoxin Xi and Sherry Chen, all the way until the recent China Initiative program that impacted so many Asian American scholars and scientists. And so our mission is try to educate our community to be more aware of the civil rights and also the civil responsibilities, and also unite among our community and participate in all aspects of the American society, and also be volunteers to be seen and to be heard. And there's a lot of things that need to be done. And also from a grassroots perspective, we have been having a lot of discussions. How can we make our community stronger? How can we make our voice heard? So there are so many different approaches. And I'm eagerly looking forward to Dr. Xi and Dr. Sakamoto's discussion from a sociology standpoint. And check us out at our website. Ohio Chinese American Association website is ohiocaa.org. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the forum.
Thank you.
I think I can go next. Hello, everybody. This is Zhong Chen. I'm the president of San Diego Asian American for Equality. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers to invite us to be the co-sponsor of this event. So San Diego Asian American for Equality, SDAFE, so we established in 2014. Our mission is to promote active involvement in public affairs and Asian American values. So we're active involved in defending our community interests and mobilizing Asian American community on issues of concerns. We have, since 2014, we have organized many programs, and then just to list a few. So we, for example, we have this annual youth legislative essay contest. So to really start from young to promote the youth to kind of actively involved in those legislative as well as civic issues. And then we have this program also called Tutoring for Change program, where we establish a long-term relationship with the local homeless organizations to help them to kind of reestablish the value, the family value and various values. And then we also organize a large number of local high school students to go routinely once every week to help those homeless kids in their academic and other performance. So we have a couple of achievements to just list a few. In 2020, we are a part of the statewide force to defend Prop 16. Also in 2020, we are the partners of US 2020 Census and partner of the All of Us Medical Research Program. In 2019, we won a settlement in a lawsuit against San Diego Unified School District for preferential treatment of its Muslim students. And then, of course, in 2014, we are part of the statewide force to table SCA 5. So please visit us at www.sdaafe.org. And I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Thank you.
I think that's all the co-sponsors, co-hosts.
Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you for all the introductions. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Joy Guo, who made a lot of efforts to connect these organizations to sponsor this webinar. So let me introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is Professor Yu Xie from Princeton University. Professor Xie is a well-known scholar in sociology, and his research areas are on social stratification, social demography, statistical methods, Chinese studies, and the sociology of science. He has published several books in these areas. Professor Xie is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of Academia Sinica, and a member of the US National Academy of Sciences. Professor Xie, is your turn. You're going to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening.
Yes, yes.
My name is Yu Xie. I'm a professor of sociology at Princeton University. Today, I'm very pleased to have the privilege of introducing to you an outstanding scholar, also a good friend of mine, Asa Sakamoto. I've known Art well for decades now because we will fellow graduate students in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the 1980s. Art is a third-generation Japanese American. Indeed, only half Japanese American. His father was a Japanese American. His mother, I believe, is Irish American. He completed a bachelor's degree in economics and sociology in 1981 from Harvard University. And he's a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1988, a year ahead of me. That's why I have always considered him my role model. Upon graduation, he started as assistant professor at the University of Texas in Austin and was promoted to associate professor with tenure in 1994 and full professor in 2013. Before that, until 2013, since 2013, he has been the cornerstone faculty fellow professor of sociology at Texas A&M University. Art's work is wide-ranging. He has studied a large number of topics, including, but not limited to, labor markets and economic inequality, racial and ethnic inequality, and Asian Americans as a demographic group. He has been influential in all these areas where he has made scholarly contributions. One important and somewhat unusual character in today's environment is that Art is rigorous, faithful to data, and not afraid of speaking up. You will get a taste of this character from his talk today. Today, Art will give a lecture with the title, Understanding the Inconvenient Minority, the Sociology of Asian Americans. Now, let me give Art the Zoom floor. Art, you may start. Thank you very much for giving the talk first. Okay, you may start.
Well, thank you, Yu Xie, for the gracious invitation, and thanks to all of the tremendous civic organizations. I appreciate this support, and thanks to everyone for zooming in. It's a real pleasure and honor, really, to speak to such a wide and esteemed group of people. I have a lot of slides here, and I will just let you know that you can download the slides if you're interested from my website, academia.edu. And when you get there, this is my website, and you can see I'm wearing the same shirt. So you can figure out who that is easily. It's under the draft section, and the PowerPoint that I'm currently using You can download it to the extent you're interested. So I have a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them quickly. I just want to give you more information rather than less. And as Professor Xie was saying, we were both trained in sort of sociology as a social science. And so we focused on the data. We're honest about its strengths and weaknesses. We're not playing games with citing elites for the sake of it. We're doing the best work we can. If you can rule out alternative explanations, that gives more credence to your own view. And we're not partisan. And so these underlying social norms of science, I've discussed more thoroughly at this YouTube lecture. You can go to YouTube and see that if you like. But I have this kind of introduction here because it's no secret that the study of race and ethnicity currently in the United States is very ideological. And so my approach is to stick as closely to the data and be faithful to the quality of data as is possible. By ideology, it's mainly the idea that they already have a fixed theory and they're trying to get the facts and the history selectively to represent their theory. And in a real science, we're trying to get the theory to fit the facts instead of getting the facts to fit the theory. And so today, it's very fashionable to have an ideological perspective. But again, as Xie has already mentioned, our approach is more sociology as a social science. There were hundreds of thousands of second-generation Japanese Americans in the 20th century, for example, who you rarely hear anything about except for the internment. And these two characters who, extreme radicals that want to blow up federal buildings and promote the spread of communists around the world, that doesn't represent the average Japanese American at that time, although this is the kind of popular topic that you see in Asian American studies these days. So I have these files here, these slides here, and they're quite extensive. You can see I'm going through them quickly, but I wanted to give you more information. People have said informally various things about me. I guess the nicest thing they ever said was that I'm a conservative, but I don't identify with that per se. I will tell you if the data say that there's discrimination. And I was among the first people to study the 1940, the 1950 census data files when they became available to researchers. And indeed, there is evidence, pretty clear evidence of a systemic disadvantage to Chinese and Japanese American men in the 1940s, in the 1950s. And so piecing together that with qualitative information and the history of the times, I think it is a reasonable hypothesis to conclude that they faced a lot of racial discrimination in that era. And I have discussed that extensively in my work. And by the way, you can download those papers from my website. But what I'm saying is that is no longer evident in the data in the post-1965 era. I mean, I will be telling you what the data say, and if it shows discrimination, we'll say that certainly, but if it doesn't, we also have to say that as well. One area where I do think the data show continuing discrimination against Asians is in the area of college admissions, where the standards are much higher for Asians. And the book on that topic that summarizes the specific Harvard case is Kenny Xu's Inconvenient Minority. So inconvenient minority means that the popular view of studying racial minorities in the US today is the kind of majority-minority approach. And in that approach, the majority has the power. That would be whites in the US, and they gain socioeconomic advantage by maintaining discrimination against minorities. And a fashionable example these days would be critical race theory, but it's basically the idea that minorities are disadvantaged relative to whites. And so when we say Asian Americans are the inconvenient minority in Kenny Xu's terms, or for Max Weber in the previous slide, inconvenient fact, from a scientific point of view, they simply don't fit this theory. Asian Americans in general are not disadvantaged relative to whites. And so for that reason, they're particularly interesting to me as a social scientist, even though I think a lot of the work that goes on tends to ignore them. In my own view, the model minority myth is something that you immediately encounter when you start talking about Asian Americans. And I view that as an example of an ideology. And so in this ideology, the majority-minority paradigm is the absolute truth, and everything about Asians is selected to try to fit and prove that perspective. And so it actually ends up with this weird form of kind of almost a liberal racism against Asian Americans. So anytime you can dig up dirt on Asians, you talk about how messed up Asians are, or find Asian gangs, or even in the area of educational attainment, where it's quite clear Asians are more likely to attend college. And by the way, that's been going on for the past 100 years. Now they will say, yeah, but those Asians, they're messed up, and they're suicidal, and they're depressed, and they're full of anxiety, and this isn't. So despite having high levels of educational attainment, they will try to say, well, that's somehow bad, and to find things that they can criticize Asian Americans for. By the way, you know, if you think it's stressful to go to college, try not going to college. How happy are Americans today who don't have a college degree? As Shay said, I also study class inequality, and for people that don't have a college degree, you know, they're very stagnant in terms of their socioeconomic outcomes. So, I mean, it's obviously a very narrow approach to try to all of a sudden criticize Asians for having high levels of college educational attainment. So, you know, I can't do everything in the next 50 minutes, but just to set the stage, the demographics really changed after 1965, where the Immigration and Nationality Act removed the old bias towards Western European countries. And so you can see here the population growth of Asian Americans really took off after the 1965 Immigration Act. In absolute terms, certainly, but also even as a percentage of the total American population, over 5% in 2018 are Asian American. Along the way, Amy Chua wrote a popular book, Ron Takaki, and then William Peterson talked about Japanese Americans in that old study in 1966. That graph might be a little hard to see. Here's the data underlying it. As late as 1960, only 0.55% of the American population was Asian American. As late as 1960, only about 1 in 209 Americans, 0.5% is 1 out of 200 Americans is Asian American. So even as late as 1960, Asian Americans were a very kind of small and specialized group. Just to put that into context, the number of Mormons in America, the number of Mormons exceeded the entire population of Asian Americans. And up until about 10 years ago, there were more Mormons than there were Asian Americans. So I'm just pointing out that we have a very diverse society, all kinds of groups of various sorts, and Asian Americans are becoming more visible. The population now is 23 million, and that's about 7,000, 7% of the total US population. And to put that in context, Asians now are approximately half the population size of the African-American population, approximately half. I don't know that I have trust the recent figures, so I didn't put them up. But what I heard was that Asians now have actually surpassed Blacks at the halfway mark, about 55% the size of Blacks. So that's a sizable population where it's no longer like 1960. Yeah, there's many groups, but it's worth noting that of the 6 largest groups, that's 85% of all Asian Americans. Chinese, Indian, Filipino being the largest. And what has happened with this demographic growth is spatial assimilation. So in 1860, you'd have to move 98% of Asians to have the same regional distribution as whites. So that shows that they're very separated in the West. Even as late as 1960, the index of similarity was 2/3, and now it's come down. So what we see here is that whereas Asians, primarily you're talking about Hawaii and California and small number of other places to a very limited degree. Now you see Asians all over the United States. There's more Asians now in Texas and New Jersey and New York than there are in Hawaii. We have a larger population. Illinois, Pennsylvania, Maryland, or Washington are approaching the size of the Hawaiian Asian population. So now, for example, as we've already heard, there's a lot of Asians in Ohio. There's a lot of Asians in New England. And so that shows that Asians now are sort of a mainstream minority in America. They aren't just this isolated, esoteric group regionally located just in Hawaii and California. They've really come into the national consciousness. So I've talked about the majority-minority paradigm. An alternative view is the assimilation model. And you're socialized by your society in terms of values and norms. You understand the culture and the institutions, you go to school there. And so you develop those sort of mainstream norms and values of your society. And so the basic assimilation model is that immigrants come in and they were socialized in China or Japan or India or Korea or what have you, and they bring some of those norms and values with them. And that influences their children because children are raised by their families, and that socialization of your parents rubs off on the second generation. But by the time you get to the third generation is much more American than they were, say, of their grandparents' generation. So that's the basic idea of the assimilation model. And what we see today is that among newlyweds in 2014-15, 29% of Asians married someone who was not Asian. And that's especially predominant among Asian American women, 37% versus 16% for males. Among newlyweds, you can see there's a considerable amount of outmarriage. It increases across the generations. The first generation outmarriage 10%, second generation 23%, and third generation, you can see that they're increasingly outmarrying. For the first generation, some of them got married in their country of origin, and they came as married persons. And the second generation, that's the group that's raised in the US. The only thing to note about this is that these figures are based on racial identity in terms of we ask you, what is your racial category? And by the second generation, there's already, in some sense, 1/3 of Japanese Americans no longer say they're Asian. So this attrition refers to individuals who do not say they're Asian. They're not Asian American. They said they're white or some other group. So you can see that if you have a mixed parent with at least one parent born in Asia, but the other born in the US, 1/3 of the mixed people no longer identifies Asian American, 18% for Chinese, 37% for Indians. And this data is for children residing in their family under age of 18. When they grow up, we'll see how they identify as adults. But I mean, to try to get to the third generation, it's a little tricky with the data. But you can see there's extensive outmerit, there's extensive attrition from that racial category, because if you have only one parent from the Asian country, then that means that you are really of a mixed ancestry, and a lot of folks drop out. It might be that if your father's side is Asian, you might retain that a little bit more. So the attrition is a little lower. So my mother's maiden name was Schofield. And so if I were Arthur Schofield, no one would think twice about me. But when I'm Arthur Sakamoto, then they think, oh, well, you must be like a Japanese guy or something, not Sakamoto. So it might be that, since I have the name, it gives me a greater consciousness. My sister has her husband's name, Pearson, Kim Pearson. I mean, you would never know that she's Asian in any way. So there might be some name effect. There could be other, social status or patriarchal issues there as well. So what I'm saying is there is, fairly quick assimilation into American society. And so, if you think about the history of slavery in the United States, the so-called one-drop rule, there are very strong barriers about who's white and who's black. Sally Hemings, the mistress of Thomas Jefferson, was 3/4 white. She was only 1/4 black, but she was a slave. I have 4 nephews and 1 niece who are 1/4 Japanese, and they're 3/4 white. None of them identify as Asian. None of them identify as Asian. My son identifies as Asian because he's half Chinese. So he's actually more Asian than he is white. So he identifies as Asian, but that's not the typical case. So, when boundaries can be abridged through intermarriage, then you don't have a very strong barrier between them. And that seems more consistent with the assimilation view. In terms of the socioeconomics, what we see here is that early on in 1959, which is like before the Civil Rights Act of 1965, Asians were approaching whites in the level of affluence here defined as 5 times the poverty line or greater. And so they weren't that different in 1959. The largest group in 1959 were Japanese and then Chinese. Other groups were there, of course, but they were extremely small. But by 2015, Asians are more likely to be affluent than whites, non-Hispanic whites, 36 versus 33%. So since about 1999, the affluent group is actually more likely to be Asian than white. And in terms of poverty, Asian do have slightly higher poverty than whites. Asian is 11.9% and 10% for whites. Although as I've shown in my research, almost all of that is attributable to recent immigrants to the US from Asia. If you look at native-born Asians, the poverty rate for native-born Asians is lower than the poverty rate for whites. And as immigration was scaled back under the Trump administration, poverty went down for all groups, but the Asian white poverty rate actually was the same in 2019 under the Trump administration because there were fewer immigrants. So the Asians are distinctive. The first sort of, in terms of socioeconomics in particular, as we see here in these data, William Peterson wrote this in 1966, and it was quite popular at the time. The Japanese were the largest group at that point, and he talked about Japanese Americans as being successful, and he talked about the strong family structure and the cultural emphasis on hard work, work ethic, and especially education. I don't think he mentioned genetics. I don't know why this person said that, but it is commonly said in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR that he coined the phrase. He invented the term model minority, and that spawned this backlash that is now known as the model minority myth. And the model minority myth is basically trying to reassert the majority minority paradigm by saying, well, actually, it's not true that they have higher socioeconomic. That's not really true. Or that there are other problems that are so important that we can't talk about assimilation. And so you see videos online, you see universities with their clubs and organizations saying, I'm not your model minority. So there's a lot of disdain for this term. And William Peterson himself is in sociological literature and in Asian American studies, is spoken of very derogatory kind of way. The reality is he never used that term. I mean, despite what everyone says, when you quote someone, you have to put it in quotes and say the page number. Everyone says William Peterson says this, but no one ever says what page did he say it on. And the reason is he never said it. This is just kind of a straw man argument that people have raised so that you won't study Japanese Americans. And so we don't study Japanese Americans except when it fits the theory, which would be between 1942 to 1945. Other than that, the other 150 years, you don't really know much. Well, let me build on Peterson and talk more about the sociology. I have talked about the demographics and the socioeconomics, but getting more into the sources of these socioeconomic differentials, I will build on Peterson's discussion. And I'm not going to call it the model minority. I think we can agree that that's a pejorative term that's not valid. So, I mean, that's why he never used it. But in the Asian values model, I think this is consistent with the assimilation view. The Asians come from Asia. They have some of that Asian values and norms that affects their children. And that's the avenue by which Asian American educational attainment and labor markets is achieved. And so, the basic idea, first of all, is that Asian Americans do not face extensive racial discrimination in the labor market. And now, as I said at the beginning, I think they did. The evidence pretty clearly shows that in 1940 and 1950. But what the model minority view is trying to say is that, okay, so they have high incomes, but it should be even higher. Because they have so much education, they're actually facing discrimination because they don't get the same rate of return as whites. And so, yeah, they're a little bit higher, but they should be even higher. That's because they face this discrimination. And this is known as the overeducation view. And so that is a very important sort of point that the model minority myth has been trying to promote. But if you look at this literature very carefully, and I've done that in my own work, and Zhen and Xie probably were the most precise and figured out that, well, the return to schooling depends on where you got your schooling and the quality of that schooling and what you studied. And so if you distinguish people who went to school in the US versus people who went to school in Asia, really then the returns to schooling were the same. If you went to Asian Americans in America who got their degree from American institutions do about the same as whites. And so the lower returns to education part of the model minority myth does not hold up to scrutiny. It really is a reflection of the assimilation that if you got your education in another country, I mean, Americans don't know what, Nihon Daigaku, Nihon, I mean, they don't know what that is. I mean, so what? I mean, we cannot evaluate education. And besides, what the Japanese call a law degree is just a general education degree. It's got nothing to do with what we think of as a law degree. So education overseas, has a lower rate of return. It's not a racial process. It's just something about the human capital. And you can, unpack that further. If you got your degree in Canada, if you got your degree in England at Cambridge, well, there are some institutions in English that do sort of carry over. And you can, figure out all those processes. Jennifer Lee and Van Tran at Columbia and Graduate Center, CUNY, they're really pushing this over-education view, which they say is the truth. And they've said it in the LA Times, in Columbia Magazine, Inside Higher Ed, and a dozen other places. They're making these claims of the over-education view. Indian Americans no more likely to obtain a profession than white Americans, but they're 8 times more likely to go to college, same for Korean and Vietnamese. So there's promoting this, and they say that it's just true. They say it's non-controversial. I've written a paper responding to them and showing the flaws in their analysis, and they won't talk to me, and they certainly didn't respond to my comment. But if you look at the data closely, I mean, it's just not there, and they don't show that evidence. And there's no strong evidence for this over-education view. To the contrary, I mean, if you just do it in the classical way, which is to look at years of schooling, Asians actually have higher rate of return than whites because they're more likely to do STEM. I mean, if you study history, if you study sociology, ethnic studies, what have you, I mean, who gets more return in education, computer science or sociology majors? So actually, Asians have a slightly higher return, not lower. So, I mean, the idea that there's extensive discrimination labor market, that's not, most of the evidence does not show that. It's also said to be a myth that there's upward mobility. Well, actually, if you look at the lowest quintile and then they grow up into the highest quintile, Asians are more than twice as likely as whites to go from rags to riches, over twice as likely. I mean, that is not a myth. That is a very high rate of intergenerational income mobility. Now, it's low among Blacks, it's low among Hispanics, it's low among American Indians. But again, the inconvenient minority, 26%, is much higher than whites. That's an incredible figure. And in terms of being born poor and becoming poor, intergenerational poverty, Asians are the lowest. African Americans are the highest. In terms of being born into the upper quintile and reproducing and staying in the upper quintile, Asians have the highest. So the idea that Asians face so much discrimination that there's no intergenerational mobility is just not consistent with the data. In fact, it's pretty amazing that if you read this report in the New York Times, they reached the conclusion of the tremendous discrimination faced by Blacks because this number is so much lower than that. But they didn't even mention Asians. I mean, if this is discrimination because it's lower than that, then why isn't that, I mean, by the same scientific logic, shouldn't this be discrimination against whites? I mean, you're saying that it's discrimination. Why are you not talking about the inconvenient minority? Well, they try to say, well, yeah, but they're just rich people coming from Asia. They're already rich, the selectivity argument. Well, actually, if you look at the Japanese that came and, they had the same kinds of upward mobility, the percent literate was not particularly high. Actually, it was lower than whites. Now, it was higher than African Americans, but African Americans in California were immigrants. So if you look at Blacks in California, early 20th century, their income distribution was about the same as whites. Blacks and Japanese had approximately the same frequency distribution. You can see here the red and the green line. And the whites, there were more wealthier people, but Asian children were not particularly wealthy. And in educational attainment, upward mobility is well established, both in quantitative and qualitative research, and that's been going on for decades. I mean, it's not a myth, it's just true. Recent research by Liu and Xie, you could see that there is an ethnic aspect here, and that the Asians, even for low socioeconomic background, they still have higher GPAs than whites, especially if you just limit to academic GPAs. So there is a lot of discussion about myths in the popular media, but this is just consistent with the data. It's more difficult to talk about values. It's hard to measure them, but we can shed some light on it. And we do know about family structure. In general, when parents get divorced, it impacts the children more than the parents realize. And from the child's point of view, the marital happiness, the child is happy, and the child doesn't, unless we're talking about extreme levels of conflict on parents, and by the way, UCA has an excellent paper on this. Generally speaking, family instability reduces upward mobility, reduces educational attainment. And in terms of Asian Americans, they have lower fertility. Korean, Japanese, Chinese are these lower numbers, and the higher trend is Hispanics have the highest level of fertility, although it's coming down. These are period total fertility rates. And the marital births among African Americans is low. It's like 30%. Whereas for Asians, it's 95% in some years. You can see that very high level of married women, and Hispanics are in the middle, and then whites are a little closer up here, 75%, 70%. So if a child is born and the mother's not married, the child doesn't have that same level of family structure and economic support to promote higher attainment. The Black population of new mothers, Black children that were born, you see there's a lot of variance, but the modal is around 22. The modal, so the most common age, is much younger than Asians. It's more like 32. So Asian women are marrying later and having children later. They're more mature, they're more married, they have more education, and it's probably a case that their relationships, their marriages are more stable. If you just look at those rags to riches figures and correlate it with proportion of non-marital births, it pretty well lines up. In terms of aspirations, Americans these days are very individualistic. They want their child to be happy. Something that South Asians and East Asians share in common. They're more concerned about the family doing well, and they believe it's their role to push the children because they don't think that a child that's 8, 10, 12 years old really understands what's best for herself. And she understands, parents have an obligation to get their children best prepared for adult life instead of letting them sort of figure out on their own what they want. Today, Americans are like, genderless child rearing. They want their child to figure out their own gender, which could be separate from your sex. So there's a high level of individualism that you don't find in Asian families. And again, this is consistent with a lot of literature. Here's more results on SES. And again, what we see is that Asians, even at the lower income level, have high levels of educational expectations for the children. And in terms of, questions about, how important is education, it's like very high at all levels for Asians. How much time do I have left, actually?
Why don't you wrap up in a couple of minutes? Can you?
Yes, I can do that. And so Asians, it's just empirically true. They study more. They're even studying during lunch more than other groups. Teachers say they work harder. Teachers say they have better class behavior. It shows up in their GPAs. Most of that is due to effort. It's not due to IQ scores. We see this in other East Asian countries. And if you look at Asian Americans, they sort of resemble Asians in Asian countries. That's the cultural influence. Germans and Australians, you see here that the social class matters more. Asian kids spend more time studying on the weekend, less time doing sports, and they spend less time doing chores. And so the same kind of pattern in Australia. So, I mean, combining all of this, I would say that, there's a lot of evidence to support this sort of Asian family explanation for the higher level of educational attainment. And so more broadly speaking, I would say that the majority-minority paradigm, and this is just my own interpretation, but putting all these results together, post-racial society means that most income inequality is within the groups. We don't live in a society where income and race are very closely connected. Now, there are differences in means, but that's about 5-6% of the total. And so if you look at Nigerians or Ghanaian immigrants, they have high education in a way similar to Asians. You can find intergenerational poverty among whites. And native-born Asian Americans are doing better than whites in general. And so we see rising class inequality and also among African Americans. But for example, the incarceration rates of college-educated Blacks is lower than less educated whites. I mean, the significance of education and class is increasing because we live in a post-industrial, knowledge-intensive society with a lot of technology. So in a post-racial society, the privilege is really having two parents that are focused on your development. And by the way, a stepfather in general is not as invested in their children. I mean, in many cases they are, but on average, they're not as much. So, I mean, this is just a summary. They do more homework, fewer chores, smaller family, more money per child, lower fertility. I mean, none of this is surprising. This is all basic sociology. And it's part of the Asian view of families that it isn't just individuals maximizing the happiness. It's your job to follow your role in the family.